Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Welcome. Today is November 13th, 2013. My name is Megan Beets of the LaRouche PAC Scientific Research Team, and I'm joined today in the studio by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche and Jason Ross, also of the Scientific Research Team.
Going to find a legitimate faith in a process that can get us out of this. What is the basis for potential solidarity among our fellow citizens, among potentially leading political figures? Where does that sense of honesty and commitment come from? And outside the political process itself, we also find a very strong potential for that in the realms of science and art. So the collapse in scientific honesty, the collapse in culture, these are not independent of the political situation that we find ourselves in right now. You know, we talked a couple of weeks ago here about the difference between sincerity, honesty, and truthfulness based on what you had written in your then most recent paper, about the difference between being sincere about your feelings, about your past experiences, about the way you respond to things based on who you have been so far. The difference between that sincerity and a truthfulness of being willing to change how your mind works. I mean, this is a pretty touchy subject. It can be a very personal subject. When you realize that in allowing yourself to know something, you actually have to change your actions and even your basic thinking process. If you say, if I'm going to accept this thing that's been presented to me, if I'm going to present this concept, this even sometimes just this fact of the matter that I see around me, to accept that as true, I'm going to have to change other of my thoughts. That can be a very difficult thing. But to be a truthful person, that's something that you have to have a willingness to do. How do we develop that? Now, recently, Megan and I had read this really wonderful essay by Friedrich Schiller on the use of the chorus in tragedy. And I'd like to read a short section of this. I think it's very helpful for making this clearer. Schiller writes, he says, you know, it's difficult to not start in the... Okay, this is a little bit in the middle, but you'll get where this is going. But how art can be at once altogether ideal, yet in the strictest sense real, how it can entirely leave the actual and yet harmonize with nature, is a problem to the multitude. And hence the distorted views which prevail in regard to poetical and plastic works. For to ordinary judgments, these two requisites seem to counteract each other, the requisites of being ideal and yet real. It is commonly supposed that one may be attained by the sacrifice of the other. The result is a failure to arrive at either. One to whom nature has given a true sensibility, but denied the plastic imaginative power, will be a faithful painter of the real. He will adapt casual appearances, but never catch the spirit of nature. He will only reproduce to us the matter of the world, which, not being our own work, the product of our creative spirit, can never have the beneficent operation of art, which is the essence of freedom. Serious indeed, but unpleasing, is the cast of thought with which such an artist and poet dismisses us. We feel ourselves painfully thrust back into the narrow sphere of reality by means of the very act which ought to have emancipated us. By art. So this is the one side. On the other hand, a writer endowed with a lively fancy, but destitute of warmth and individuality of feeling, will not concern himself in the least about truth. He will sport with the stuff of the world and endeavor to surprise by whimsical combinations. And as his whole performance is nothing but foam and glitter, he will, it is true, engage the attention for a time, but build up and confirm nothing in the understanding. His playfulness is, like the gravity of the other, thoroughly unpoetical. To string together at will fantastical images is not to travel into the realm of the ideal. And the imitative reproduction of the actual cannot be called the representation of nature. Both requisites stand so little in contradiction to each other that they are rather one and the same thing. That art is only true insomuch as it forsakes the actual and becomes purely ideal. Nature herself is an idea of the mind, and is never presented to the senses. She lies under the veil of appearances, but is herself never apparent. To the art of the ideal alone is lent, or rather absolutely given, the privilege to grasp the spirit of the all and bind it in a corporeal form. He concludes in this section, yet in truth, even art cannot present it to the senses, but by means of her creative power to the imaginative faculty alone. And it is thus that she becomes more true than all reality, and more real than all experience. It follows from these premises that the artist can use no single element taken from reality as he finds it, that his work must be ideal in all its parts, if it be designed to have, as it were, an intrinsic reality, and to harmonize with nature. This, if you'd like to read, this translation is by A. Lodge. It's available. You can find. It's the one you'll find on Project Gutenberg or elsewhere on the internet. I think that this will probably be surprising, or perhaps shocking to people who hear this. That Schiller is saying that the artist can take no element from reality as he finds it. It must be ideal in all of its parts if it is to harmonize with nature. That sounds very contradictory. If you take nothing from the sensed world around you and leave it truly alone as it was sensed, and you insist on making everything in part, everything ideal, that you make it as an ideal thought, as a human thing, that is the way to harmonize with nature. That the painter who reproduces the perceptions is not actually presenting what is natural, and that the person who is presenting a number of fantastical concepts, as he called it, is thoroughly unpoetical, that this does not travel into the realm of the ideal. Think about what this means. The use of, in Schiller's plays, for example, the power of the events in William Tell, for example. So, just one example that sticks out to me the most in that one was the gouging of the eyes. It's a very powerful act that occurs in the play. It doesn't occur on the scene. You hear about it, but you respond to it in the context of his play more strongly than if you had seen it yourself, more strongly than if it were an actual act. It wasn't something that's perceived. Schiller had taken that and brought it into the ideal, which made it more real than all of the special effects of Hollywood could have made it, because he made that act more real in the imaginative faculty, in terms of what it actually means. Or the we've experienced this in plays, in dramas, that the events themselves, the eeriness that you describe, for example, in Macbeth with the Birnam Wood, the elements of seeming unreality that make the play actually more real, and I think Schiller would say more harmonizing with nature, because the essence of the natural doesn't lie in our perceptions or the data taken by a scientist in the laboratory itself. This was understood by scientists. There's a fight in science on this exact same matter, where the two seem to be contradictory. You have the scientist who, like the first painter, who reproduces reality as it appears to him and therefore misses its essence. You have the scientist, the empiricist, who takes data, who draws correlations among the data, who says that a law of nature is a formula that expresses the interaction of forces or heats or something like this. There's something real in that, but it's not the essence of nature. Then you get often people who take an overly amateurish view to science, where they accept just about anything, any theory is possible, and they don't really have the rigor to find out, to go beyond the stage of questioning and inquiring to actually get some answers there. But this separation of the mind and the universe, as the thoroughly evil Russell pushed, or foolish Richard Dawkins, who says that the ideas of intention are foreign to nature, and then he ascribes intention to genes. Anyway, that's kind of silly of him. Or Descartes, sort of the founder, the main modern founder of this separation. That the problem being that there's a view that you can express the world around us in mathematics, which is completed and dead by its nature. That fundamentally we don't have to change our concept of how nature might work. We just need to refine it and have more detail. Now, Planck and Einstein didn't have this problem. Neither did Riemann. Planck and Einstein, these were scientists, and they were real artists. And these were musicians. Rather good musicians, as a matter of fact. And they didn't have this trouble in looking at the phenomena that presented themselves towards the end of their lives, the quantum phenomena that so perplexed and confused everybody, the quantum phenomena that led to the imposition of quantum mechanics, saying that fundamentally nature is uncertain, it's fundamentally random, that our mind will never be able to understand certain aspects of it because they're fundamentally unknown even to nature itself. And this conclusion was reached without taking the time to fully explore these quantum processes in larger scales than individual particles operating on each other and outside the abiotic. It is certain without a doubt that life, the study of life, will provide insights into physics it will never get on its own. That the study of cognition, of our reason, will provide necessary insights without which the resolution of these problems in physics and biology will never be explained. Because what is the context of any of these things? They all exist in a universe which expresses creativity. We express it willfully, but if we look at the evolution, the development of life forms, if we even look before that at the development of the solar system, but if you look at the evolution of life, you see an increasing complexity, and you can measure it in very definite ways. An increased flow of energy through life, the development of what we would certainly call new technologies in life, the move to land, the use of oxygen, warm-blooded creatures, predation, being self-moving as opposed to sitting around, as the early animals were. These developments, that is part of nature, the evolution, the development of nature, the development of our understanding. We are a force of nature. The human mind is natural. It's a part of nature. These environmentalists, who are really just anti-human, who believe that anything we do is inherently bad because they've defined a priori that we are unnatural, I think they should take that up with nature. What are we doing here if we're unnatural? Obviously we're here. The power of the mind exists. It is a natural force. To single it out and say it's terrible, it makes about as much sense as saying that the use of electricity is unnatural. Really? It's there. So the truthfulness and the morality of a scientist, it's never done. You have to have a willingness to change, and you have to develop an ability to have a sense of what's truthful, and a development in your own mind, a sense of the development of improving knowledge. And this is not in education. Certainly now, and not for some time, it's been decreasing. Actually having, say, a laboratory course even, where you do some experiments that are not done on a computer simulation, but you look at real physical things and actually see how they operate. This is fast disappearing. It's being replaced with playing around on an iPad and pretending you're doing a real experiment. People are getting less and less ability to relate directly to nature, to understand how these things really work. So this willingness to change, it's not, you see it on different levels. You see it as in the person who is finally peeling the Obama bumper sticker off their car, maybe wishing they hadn't gotten it, maybe covering it up with a different sticker because you can tell there used to be something there. Or in the person who realizes that to get an economic concept, to really understand economics, they're going to have to change how they decide to spend their Friday and Saturday nights, because that private life of theirs precludes their understanding how an economy functions. And I mean that. That's a real thing. that truthfulness and that honesty is necessary. Now, I mean, today's crisis, it wasn't really unavoidable in a fundamental sense. I mean, it didn't have to take the shape that it has today, but Mr. LaRouche, as you've been clear on in your writings over decades, there is a fundamental fight between Zeus and Prometheus. And almost like the reptiles could only go so far before they were supplanted with mammals, a human society that tolerates aspects of oligarchism in it will reach a limit. And we're reaching that limit right now. You know, these crises that we see, the war crisis, the war threat, the economic collapse, this is an unavoidable, it's an unduckable issue. And to resolve it, we are going to need a commitment among an increased portion of the population not to tolerate the concept of oligarchy. What kind of mind does that require people to have, to be able to stand up as actual representatives of what society ought to be? Mammal analogy, that many of the reptiles, which used to be the kings of the earth, have now decreased in their relative abundance with the rise of mammals. Or like the test pilots going through the sound barrier and reaching a point at which their engines would stall out. They couldn't get through without changing the form of the airplane. That if we've got the baggage of queens and dukes and oligarchy and Wall Street all attached to this, to where we're trying to go, we simply aren't going to get through this boundary. And an ability among people to be better than that is something that we have to foster and create. I mean, for anybody in the greater D.C. area and beyond who can come to our concert of the Mozart Requiem on November 22nd, this will be an example of a presentation of a truthfulness in culture that helps provide the basis for being able to, when the future asks, if the future is asking you, can I count on you? Let the future ask you that. Can I count on you? Can we count on you? Can these future children, can they count on you? Will you make a livable, as you said, a worthwhile and enjoyable life a possibility for them? What prevents you from saying yes? What prevents you more broadly culturally from saying yes? To what extent is there a separation in your life, almost a mild schizophrenia, or maybe not so mild, between what you would like to do publicly, between your view of yourself as a political actor or as a hopeful political actor, as an aspiring one, and what parts of your private life prevent you from doing that? Is there a dissonance between them? Let me finish. I'm going to read a quote from your 1979 book, The Power of Reason, where you wrote about this. You said that truth is directly contrary to those popularized absurd prejudices which make a qualitative distinction between the public and the personal life of the individual. Unfortunately, the distinction is not merely an ignorant prejudice, but a wretched opinion which has been translated into belief and practice in most of our society. There is a school of opinion which argues that evidence of a predominant practice proves the agreement between such a practice and human nature. If the argument were extended, it would have to be argued that in a population predominantly affected with cholera, syphilis, or pneumonic plague, those conditions, too, must be expressive of the requirements of human nature. The mere fact that most men and women are alienated, that the public and private segments of their lives are qualitatively distinct, is scarcely evidence that such a dichotomy has any basis in the requirements of human nature. It is, rather, evidence of that awful persistence of a disorder, of a social disease. You say a little bit after that, all my life, you write, I have been sustained by an unusual work drive, which we've all witnessed, because what I desired to accomplish in public facets of my life was the meaning of my personal life. And I have achieved joy in my personal life because every contribution to public life contributes directly to giving meaning to each facet of the more intimate, personal facets of my life. I would not tolerate in my public life a purpose inconsistent with the purpose of my life as a whole, and would not tolerate a compartmentalized aspect of personal life, a difference in outlook and purpose with those which shape my public life. how many people can that be said of today? You might be the only one.
What I know. Because if I try to just tell them what I know, and I can prove it, they will go wild. Because it's contradictory to every assumption they believe. Because their assumptions are belief in sense perception. The doctrine is that sense perception is the only truth. An experience of sense perception as such is only that. Now, what's the difference? Mankind and animals are different, fundamentally different in one respect. The animal is limited to the animal, the play and interplay of the emotions and so forth which are associated with animal life. Human life actually goes to a higher level. We challenge sense perception. We say that sense perception is a delusion which animals suffer. But we as human beings are capable of discovering principles which lie beyond sense perception. And because we understand the paradoxes, the contradictions which are inherent in the relationship between man and his own sense perception. And that's what's called creativity. There are many manifestations of it. For example, my particular skill is forecasting the future. Now, I don't do it by getting gizmos. I don't believe in gizmos. They're more gimmicks. I recognize that mankind his identity of mankind does not lie within sense perception. That is, the existence of mankind does not lie within sense perception. That's the point. So if you look in mirrors or all these other things, all you may get is some unhappy views of life. But there is no creativity in that as such. The willful creativity, which is specific to mankind among all known species now, most people base everything on that. They're reductionists. They call them reductionists. They are essentially reductionists. And reductionism is a disease of a form of insanity, of the inability of the human being to behave in a way which is specific uniquely to a human being. The human being is always looking at the errors of sense perception and extending practices to show there's a contradiction. Now, we have two areas of contradiction. One we call physical science. Well, physical science is not the original source of this capability of mankind. What we call artistic composition is the source. We imagine something, but that's science. All scientific discovery is based on imagination. The human being imagines a possible experience which has never occurred to him or her before. This is the process of education in the school system, true education. If you challenge, with teachers and so forth, are supposed to challenge students, not indoctrinate them. Challenge them, because the question of truth is, do you know what the truth is? Do you know what the meaning of truth is? And the animals are incapable of this. The animals react, and they will sometimes die as a result of their own reaction. But the human being always recognizes that sense perception is wrong and is out there to prove that it's wrong by showing demonstrations of paradoxes which are created in that form. In other words, what you do is you destroy the confidence of the human mind in the products of deductive sense perception. That's your problem. And there is no competent science who relies on deductive method, because you're always talking about the future. If you cannot think about the future, if you cannot imagine the future, which means you're also able to test the truthfulness of that imagination in terms of reality. Well, you make a discovery, a scientific discovery, for example, the discovery of principle. Well, you can prove that because you can demonstrate it. And what you're demonstrating was that sense perception was wrong. And that's what mankind is. So when you talk about the human soul, most people don't know what a human soul is. Well, how would you define a human soul? You mean it's outside sense perception? Yes. The human soul exists only outside sense perception. It lies only in the domain of human creativity.
The mind's eye. And this was recognized very explicitly by Planck and Einstein. I mean, Einstein has this famous quotation that imagination is more important than knowledge or than experience. I forget the exact. Yeah. But then Planck even spends quite a bit of energy and time in his writings, as well as his speeches, developing the idea of the creative artistic imagination. And he even says explicitly that the sense apparatus, even experimental apparatus, will limit what can be discovered. And the only way to make a true discovery is to use the sense perceptions of the mind and the power of the creative human imagination to imagine how processes ought to be, and to imagine their creation, and to be able to penetrate into reality to a degree which no sense perception, no matter how powerful, could ever penetrate. And that really tells you what the purpose of scientific experiment is. The purpose of scientific experiment is to validate what the creative imagination had already known. And you see that, you know, how was Planck able to think like this? Well, it's because he was a creative artist. And he came out of the social and artistic tradition in Germany of the classical tradition of Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Schiller, who was an incredibly important thinker, yeah, which contributed to human culture and the ability of the human species to break away from this determination by sense perception and bestiality. And it was Schiller's view that it is the role of art to give the human beings who might even be in a savage state, as most of our people today are, it's the role of art to give people an experience of truthfulness, which is outside of time and outside of their current existence and sense perception, and to train the mind to prefer that type of existence. And that is the vehicle by which you can transition a society from what we're seeing today to something which could actually survive and prosper.
This is the most untruthful period of experience, I think, in all history, at least from my standpoint. No, that's what the problem is. There is a truth which we can know, but we have to fight step by step, every step of the way, to find out what the truth is. You don't get the final answer. What you get is a more and more distance from sense perception, from reliance on sense perception. You say, well, sense perception, we're still hanging around here. We're going with it so far. But we're going less now than we would before. When you go, now mankind is going in a different direction, the opposite direction, back to the obscure. But it's what I am. It's what I do. I'm nothing other than that. I mean, really. I mean, with my age and so forth, what am I except this functionary of that type? And I have a lot of fun at it at the same time. But that's the rewards I get, is the fun of discovery, the fun of sharing discovery. The sharing of a discovery is what's the most fun. To give somebody a stimulus of an idea, leads them to an idea, which then occupies them, with a sense of real achievement, open door, make their life more colorful, more interesting. That's what it's all about. That's how it works. That's the mechanism of how it works. And you would share this with people who enjoy it. That's what really the basis. That's why it's so difficult to separate true science from true art. You cannot separate them, because they both have the same effect of this joy that they stimulate in the people. So you do it as, you call it entertainment. Often you see great dramas, that's called entertainment, but it's really science. Shakespeare is really science. And that's a wonderful thing.
Because it's beautiful, it's fun, it's not drudgery, and it is improving.
Yeah. I run up and downstairs, as you know, just on the fact of some little niche of something which is important to get it put into discussion and so forth. Yeah. But it's all based on this, simply that. Nothing else. It's recognizing that sense perception is not truth. Sense perception is a reflection of the effect of animal experience. And what you have to do is understand that it's that, and then say, what if that's true, then what is the principle, the scientific principle, which is not sense perception? Because science is the progress of man against sense perception. And even me, in my old age, I can still have the pleasure of that.
So can we. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to leave off. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Of the beneficent operation of art, which is the essence of freedom. Serious indeed, but unpleasing is the cast of thought with which such an artist and poet dismisses us. We feel ourselves painfully thrust back into the narrow sphere of reality by means of the very act which ought to have emancipated us, by art. So this is the one side. On the other hand, a writer endowed with a lively fancy, but destitute of warmth and individuality of feeling, will not concern himself in the least about truth. He will sport with the stuff of the world and endeavor to surprise by whimsical combinations. And as his whole performance is nothing but foam and glitter, he will, it is true, engage the attention for a time, but build up and confirm nothing in the understanding. His playfulness is, like the gravity of the other, thoroughly
Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Welcome. Today is November 13th, 2013. My name is Megan Beets of the LaRouche PAC Scientific Research Team, and I'm joined today in the studio by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche and Jason Ross, also of the Scientific Research Team.
going to find a legitimate faith in a process that can get us out of this. What is the basis for potential solidarity among our fellow citizens, among potentially leading political figures? Be at once altogether ideal, yet in the strictest sense real. How it can entirely leave the actual and yet harmonize with nature is a problem to the multitude, and hence the distorted views which prevail in regard to poetical and plastic works. For to ordinary judgments, these two requisites seem to counteract each other, the requisites of being ideal and yet real. It is commonly supposed that one may be attained by the sacrifice of the other. The result is a failure to arrive at either. One to whom nature has given a true sensibility, but denied the plastic imaginative power, will be a faithful painter of the real. He will adapt casual appearances, but never catch the spirit of nature. He will only reproduce to us the matter of the world, which, not being our own work, the product of our creative spirit, can never have. Where does that sense of honesty and commitment come from? And outside the political process itself, we also find a very strong potential for that in the realms of science and art. So the collapse in scientific honesty, the collapse in culture, these are not independent of the political situation that we find ourselves in right now. You know, we talked a couple of weeks ago here about the difference between sincerity, honesty, and truthfulness, based on what you had written in your then most recent paper, about the difference between being sincere about your feelings, about your past experiences, about the way you respond to things based on who you have been so far. The difference between that sincerity and a truthfulness of being willing to change how your mind works. I mean, this is a pretty touchy subject. It can be a very personal subject. When you realize that in allowing yourself to know something, you actually have to change your actions and even your basic thinking process. If you say, if I'm going to accept this thing that's been presented to me, if I'm going to present this concept, this even sometimes just this fact of the matter that I see around me, to accept that as true, I'm going to have to change other of my thoughts. That can be a very difficult thing, but to be a truthful person, that's something that you have to have a willingness to do. How do we develop that? Now, recently, Megan and I had read this really wonderful essay by Friedrich Schiller on the use of the chorus in tragedy. And I'd like to read a short section of this. I think it's very helpful for making this clearer. Schiller writes, he says, you know, it's difficult to not start in the, okay, this is a little bit in the middle, but you'll get where this is going. But how art can be